They called me maintenance staff. Hospital corners and bleach buckets, that's all they saw when I walked the halls of Rampart Medical Center. Just another face in scrubs pushing a cart full of linens through corridors that smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams. For 3 years, I'd been invisible to everyone who mattered. Until the morning when chaos erupted in the trauma wing, and General Harrison caught sight of the ink on my forearm while I was stripping blood-stained sheets from a gurney. That's when everything changed. Because some tattoos tell stories that can save lives, and some stories refuse to stay buried no matter how deep you try to bury them. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning shift at Rampart Medical Center started like every other morning for the past 37 months. My alarm screamed at 4:30, dragging me from dreams that always seemed to end the same way, with sand in my mouth and the sound of rotors fading into desert silence. I rolled out of my narrow bed in the studio apartment I could barely afford, pulled on the same forest green scrubs that marked me as housekeeping staff, and drove through empty streets to a job that paid just enough to keep me fed and invisible. Rampart Medical Center sits on the edge of Fort Meridian like a concrete monument to military efficiency. 10 stories of beige walls and fluorescent lighting, treating everything from training injuries to combat trauma flown in from overseas deployments. I'd been working there since my discharge, cleaning rooms and making beds for soldiers who looked right through me like I was part of the furniture. Most days, that invisibility felt like protection. Some days, it felt like drowning. I clocked in at 5:45, grabbed my cart from the supply closet, and started my rounds on the 3rd floor. Pediatric wing first, then surgical recovery, then the trauma unit where the real stories lived. Every room told a different tale of service and sacrifice, but I wasn't supposed to read those stories. I was supposed to change sheets, empty trash, and disappear before the medical staff noticed I existed. My supervisor, Janet Kowalski, had made that clear from day one. She was a woman in her 50s who treated housekeeping like a military operation, which made sense since she'd never actually served. Janet believed in hierarchy, and in her world, former combat medics who'd been drummed out of service belonged at the bottom of that hierarchy. She reminded me of this regularly, usually while standing too close and speaking too loud. "Martinez," she called as I rounded the corner toward the elevator bank. Her voice carried that particular tone that meant I was about to receive another lecture about staying in my lane. I stopped my cart and turned to face her, keeping my expression neutral. 3 years of practice had taught me that neutral was safest. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, using the courtesy title that seemed to satisfy whatever authority complex drove her daily interactions with staff. "Room 347 needs a complete strip and sanitization. Trauma case came through last night. Blood everywhere. I want those linens changed, floors mopped, and the whole room spotless before the morning shift briefing." She consulted her clipboard with the importance of someone planning a military campaign instead of assigning cleaning duties. Room 347 was in the trauma wing, which meant it was connected to the emergency cases that arrived without warning, combat injuries, training accidents, the kind of medical emergencies that reminded everyone in the building that war was still happening somewhere, even if most people preferred not to think about it. I nodded and pushed my cart toward the elevator. The trauma wing operated differently from the rest of the hospital. Security was tighter, access was restricted, and the staff moved with the kind of purpose that came from dealing with life and death decisions every day. I'd learned to navigate these hallways quietly, efficiently, without drawing attention to myself. The last thing anyone wanted was housekeeping staff getting in the way during a medical emergency. Room 347 sat at the end of a corridor lined with identical doors, each one hiding stories I wasn't supposed to know. I knocked twice, waited for a response that didn't come, then used my key card to enter. The smell hit me immediately. Blood, antiseptic, and something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. The kind of smell that stuck to your clothes and followed you home. The room looked like a war zone. Blood spatters across the walls, surgical equipment scattered on the floor, bandage wrappers and medical waste covering every surface. Someone had fought for their life in this room, and from the amount of blood it had been touch and go. I pulled on latex gloves and started gathering the debris, working methodically through the chaos. The sheets on the hospital bed were soaked through with blood that had already started to turn brown at the edges. I stripped them carefully, rolling the fabric to contain the biohazard materials. This was part of the job that never got easier. Every blood stain represented someone's pain, someone's fear, someone's desperate fight to survive. I'd seen enough blood in my previous life to understand what it meant when there was this much of it. As I worked, voices echoed from the hallway. Medical staff discussing cases, administrators coordinating schedules, the usual background noise of a hospital in full operation. I tried not to listen, but certain words had a way of cutting through the white noise. Words like combat trauma, and emergency surgery, and touch and go. Words that brought back memories I'd spent 3 years trying to forget. I was stripping the final pillowcase when the door burst open behind me. I turned to see a nurse in surgical scrubs, her face flushed with exertion and stress. She looked around the room, taking in the cleaning supplies and my housekeeping uniform. "Are you almost finished in here?" she asked, her tone urgent but not unkind. "We've got an incoming trauma case, multiple casualties from a training exercise. This room needs to be ready in 10 minutes. "Yes, ma'am," I replied, moving faster to gather my supplies. "Just finishing the linens." She nodded and disappeared back into the hallway, leaving me alone with the familiar weight of urgency and purpose. Multiple casualties meant bad day for someone. Training exercise meant it had happened here, on domestic soil, to soldiers who thought they were safe. I finished cleaning the room in 7 minutes, restocked the medical supplies from my cart, and wheeled everything back into the hallway. The trauma wing was transforming around me. Medical staff moved with practiced efficiency, preparing for casualties that were already en route. I could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors, growing louder as they approached the landing pad on the hospital roof. Somewhere above us, injured soldiers were about to discover whether their training and luck would be enough to carry them through whatever had gone wrong. I was heading toward the elevator when the first stretcher came through the emergency doors. A young soldier, probably not much older than 20, conscious but pale with shock. His left leg was immobilized in a field splint, and his uniform was torn and dirty. Behind him came another stretcher, then another. The training exercise had gone very wrong for someone. As housekeeping staff, I was supposed to clear the area during medical emergencies. Stay out of the way, let the professionals handle their work. Return later to clean up whatever mess remained. 3 years of following those rules had taught me to become invisible during moments like this. But something about the third stretcher made me pause. The soldier was unconscious, his face covered in dust and blood. His uniform bore the insignia of the 75th Ranger Regiment, and his gear was marked with the kind of wear that came from real deployment, not training exercises. This wasn't a rookie who'd made a mistake during a drill. This was an experienced operator who'd encountered something unexpected. I was turning away when I caught sight of his exposed forearm. Below the sleeve of his torn uniform, partially visible through dirt and dried blood, was a tattoo that made my breath catch in my throat. Black ink forming a design I recognized from dreams that still woke me in cold sweats. The Crimson Angels. Unit designation for a special operations team that had vanished in the Hindu Kush Mountains 3 years ago. A team that officially never existed, deployed on a mission that had been classified so deeply that even the casualty reports were buried. I knew that tattoo because I'd worn the same one until my discharge. I knew it because I'd been there the night 14 operators went into those mountains, and only 5 came out. I knew it because the man on that stretcher was supposed to be dead, along with 8 other soldiers whose names were carved into a memorial wall I visited every Veterans Day. The medical team was working frantically around the stretcher, calling out vital signs and medical terminology that painted a picture of someone fighting for their life. I stood frozen in the hallway, staring at ink that represented ghosts made flesh. Either I was looking at a dead man, or everything I'd been told about that mission was a lie. "Martinez!" Janet's voice cut through my paralysis like a blade. "What are you doing standing around? Clear the area, now." I snapped back to reality, grabbing my cart and moving toward the elevator. But my mind was racing with implications that threatened to tear apart 3 years of carefully constructed routine. If that soldier was who I thought he was, then someone had been lying about what happened in those mountains. And if they'd been lying about that, then maybe they'd been lying about why I'd been discharged, why my records had been sealed, why I'd been forced to disappear into a job that treated me like I'd never served my country at all. The elevator doors closed behind me, but I could still hear the sound of medical equipment and urgent voices working to save a man who wasn't supposed to exist. My hands were shaking as I pressed the button for the ground floor. 3 years of making beds and emptying trash cans. 3 years of pretending that my previous life had never happened, and now the past was lying on a stretcher in the trauma wing. I spent the rest of my shift in a fog, going through the motions of cleaning rooms and restocking supplies while my mind processed what I'd seen. The tattoo could have been a coincidence. Unit insignias got reused, recycled, assigned to new formations. Maybe I was seeing patterns that didn't exist, connections that weren't there. Maybe 3 years of isolation and manual labor had finally driven me to hallucinations, but deep down, I knew what I'd seen. The Crimson Angels tattoo wasn't just unit identification, it was memorial ink, commemorating soldiers who died in classified operations. You didn't get that tattoo unless you'd been there, unless you'd earned it through blood and loss and the kind of brotherhood that survived even death. And according to official records, everyone who'd earned that tattoo was either dead or had never existed in the first place. Lunch break came and went without me eating. I sat in the cafeteria, staring at a sandwich I couldn't taste, watching hospital staff move through their daily routines. Doctors discussed cases. Nurses shared gossip. Administrators worried about budgets and schedules. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that somewhere above them, a ghost was fighting for his life in a room I'd cleaned that morning. The afternoon brought its own routine of cleaning and maintenance, but I found myself gravitating toward the trauma wing whenever possible. I told myself I was just checking supply levels, restocking cleaning materials, doing my job, but really I was looking for information about the soldier with the tattoo. Any scrap of intelligence that might confirm or deny what I thought I'd seen. I was restocking paper towels in a supply closet when I overheard 2 nurses discussing the morning's casualties. Their conversation was the kind of medical shop talk that happened between professionals who dealt with trauma every day, clinical and direct. "The ranger with the head injury is stable but still unconscious," one of them said. "Dr. Patterson thinks there might be some memory issues when he wakes up. Traumatic brain injury from the explosion." "What about the others from the exercise?" the second nurse asked. 2, discharged already. "The one with the broken leg will be here another week." "But the unconscious one, there's something strange about his records. No emergency contact, no next of kin listed. His file is mostly redacted." I froze behind the supply closet door, every nerve in my body suddenly alert. Redacted files meant classified background. No emergency contact meant someone who'd been cut loose from official connections. Someone whose existence had been deliberately obscured. "Maybe he's special operations," the first nurse suggested. "Those guys usually have restricted files." "Maybe." Dr. Chen tried to access his medical history for treatment planning, but the computer system keeps kicking back authorization errors. Like his records exist, but we're not cleared to see them. Their voices faded as they moved down the hallway, leaving me alone with the growing certainty that I hadn't been imagining things. The soldier in the trauma wing was connected to classified operations, just like the men who died in the Hindu Kush. Men whose deaths I'd been ordered to forget, whose mission I'd been instructed to erase from memory along with my own involvement. I finished my shift at 3 o'clock, clocked out, and drove home through afternoon traffic that seemed to move in slow motion. My studio apartment felt smaller than usual, cramped with memories I'd been trying to suppress for 3 years. I sat on my couch, staring at the wall where I'd hung my discharge papers, the only proof I had that I'd once been something other than housekeeping staff. The official story was that I'd been medically discharged for post-traumatic stress following a training accident. Clean, simple, bureaucratic. No mention of special operations. No reference to classified missions. Nothing that connected me to the team that had vanished in the mountains. My service record had been sanitized, my combat experience erased, my medical training reduced to a footnote about stress-related disorders. But I remembered everything. The night briefing in a tent outside Bagram. The intelligence reports about high-value targets hiding in caves that twisted through ancient mountainsides. The helicopter insertion that had gone perfectly until the moment everything went wrong. I remembered the sound of gunfire echoing off stone walls, the smell of cordite and blood, the weight of wounded soldiers I'd carried through darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. Most of all, I remembered the faces of the 9 men who hadn't made it out. Their names were classified, their deaths were classified, their very existence had been classified, but I carried their memories like scars, and I'd sworn an oath to never forget them, even if the military had ordered me to pretend they'd never lived. Now one of them was lying in a hospital bed 20 minutes from my apartment, either alive when he should have been dead, or carrying secrets that someone had tried very hard to bury. Either way, I was the only person in that building who understood what his tattoo really meant. The next morning started exactly like the previous one, except this time I knew where I was going and what I might find when I got there. I clocked in early, grabbed my cart, and headed straight for the trauma wing. If the soldier was awake, if he was who I thought he was, then I needed to see him before someone decided to transfer him somewhere I couldn't reach. Room 347 was occupied again, but this time the patient was conscious. I could see him through the small window in the door, sitting up in bed with bandages wrapped around his head. His face was older than I remembered, marked by 3 years of experiences I could only imagine, but the bone structure was unmistakable. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres, Crimson Angels Forward Reconnaissance Specialist, officially killed in action in the Hindu Kush Mountains of Afghanistan. I stood in the hallway, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was seeing. Torres had been declared dead along with 8 other operators. Their bodies had never been recovered. Their mission had been classified beyond any reasonable level of security, and their families had been told they'd died in a training accident. I'd attended his memorial service, watched his wife cry over a flag-draped coffin that contained sandbags instead of remains. But there he was, alive and conscious and sporting a head injury from what the nurses had described as a training exercise explosion, which meant either the dead had risen or someone had been running a very sophisticated lie for the past 3 years. I was still staring through the window when footsteps approached from behind me. Heavy, purposeful steps that belonged to someone accustomed to command authority. I turned to see a man in dress uniform approaching the room, his chest decorated with ribbons that told the story of a career spent in combat zones. 2 stars on his collar identified him as a major general, and his expression suggested he was not happy to be here. General Patricia Harrison was a legend in special operations circles. She'd commanded Ranger battalions in Iraq, Special Forces groups in Afghanistan, and joint task forces in classified operations across 3 continents. I'd never met her personally, but every operator in the community knew her reputation. Tough, smart, absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting her soldiers and accomplishing the mission. She stopped at the door to room 347, consulted a tablet computer, then looked through the window at the patient inside. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see tension in her shoulders that suggested this wasn't a routine visit. She was here for reasons that had nothing to do with medical care and everything to do with the kind of problems that required general officer attention. I should have moved away, returned to my cleaning duties, minded my own business. But something about her presence confirmed that what I was seeing wasn't coincidence or misidentification. General Harrison didn't visit training accident victims. She didn't make unscheduled appearances at military hospitals unless something was seriously wrong. Her presence meant that Torres' survival was connected to operations that reached far above the level of routine medical care. General Harrison entered the room, closing the door behind her. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see through the window as she pulled a chair close to Torres' bed and began speaking in low, urgent tones. Whatever they were discussing, it was serious enough to warrant personal attention from one of the most senior officers in Special Operations Command. I was watching their conversation when a hand landed on my shoulder, causing me to jump like I'd been electrocuted. I turned to find Janet standing behind me, her expression somewhere between suspicious and annoyed. "Martinez, what are you doing loitering in the hallway? You've got rooms to clean." "Yes, ma'am," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Just checking the supply levels." "Supply levels don't require staring through patient windows. Move along." I nodded and pushed my cart toward the next room, but my mind was racing with questions that demanded answers. Why was Torres alive when he should have been dead? What had really happened in the Hindu Kush? And why was General Harrison personally involved in what was supposed to be a routine training accident recovery? The rest of my shift passed in a blur of routine tasks performed with half my attention. I cleaned rooms, restocked supplies, and emptied trash while my mind processed implications that threatened to unravel 3 years of carefully maintained routine. Every time I passed room 347, I caught glimpses of General Harrison still in conversation with Torres. Whatever they were discussing, it was taking hours to cover all the relevant points. It was nearly 2 o'clock when General Harrison finally emerged from the room. She looked tired, stressed, like someone who'd just received information she didn't want to hear. She consulted her tablet again, made a phone call that lasted less than 30 seconds, then headed toward the elevator bank with the purposeful stride of someone who had urgent business elsewhere. I waited until she was gone, then found an excuse to clean the hallway outside room 347. Torres was alone now, staring at the ceiling with the expression of someone trying to process information that didn't fit with his previous understanding of reality. His face was pale, drawn, marked by exhaustion that went beyond physical injury. I was debating whether to risk entering his room when fate made the decision for me. The door opened and Torres emerged, dressed in hospital scrubs and moving with the careful gait of someone dealing with a head injury. He looked around the hallway, oriented himself, then started walking toward the elevator with obvious determination to be somewhere else. "Sir," I called softly, using the military courtesy that felt natural after years of ingrained habit. "You shouldn't be out of bed without medical clearance." He turned to look at me, and for a moment his expression was blank, confused. Then something flickered in his eyes, a recognition that went beyond simple acknowledgement. He studied my face like he was trying to place a memory that wouldn't quite focus. "Do I know you?" he asked, his voice hoarse from injury and medication. I glanced around the hallway, confirming we were alone, then made a decision that would change everything. I rolled up the sleeve of my scrubs, exposing the tattoo on my forearm. The same design he carried, the same memorial link that connected us to 9 dead soldiers, and a mission that officially never happened. "Crimson Angels," I said quietly. "Extraction Team Medical Specialist. I was there the night you died." The words hung between us like a bridge across 3 years of lies and buried truth. Torres stared at my exposed tattoo, his eyes moving from the familiar design to my face and back again. I watched recognition dawn slowly, fighting through whatever fog the head injury and medication had created in his memory. "Elena Martinez," he whispered, and hearing my name in his voice was like hearing a ghost speak. "Doc Martinez. You pulled Kowalski out of that cave system when the ceiling started coming down." I nodded, feeling emotions I'd kept buried for 3 years threatening to surface. "You carried Rodriguez for 2 clicks with a dislocated shoulder. You wouldn't let anyone else take him." Torres leaned against the wall, his face pale with something beyond physical exhaustion. "They told us you were dead. All of you. General Morrison said the extraction team got caught in a secondary explosion. No survivors." "Morrison told us the same thing about your unit," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "Cave-in during reconnaissance. No bodies recovered, but presumed KIA. I went to your memorial service, Michael. I watched your wife cry over an empty coffin." The hallway around us felt charged with electricity, like the air before a lightning strike. 3 years of official lies were crumbling in the space between us, revealing a truth that neither of us had been prepared to face. If Torres was alive, if I was alive, then someone had orchestrated an elaborate deception that reached to the highest levels of military command. "We need to talk," Torres said, glancing nervously toward the elevator bank. "But not here. Too many ears, too many eyes." I understood his caution. Military hospitals were honeycombed with surveillance equipment, and conversations like ours had a way of reaching people who preferred some truths to stay buried. But finding a secure location for discussion wasn't going to be simple, especially with Torres technically being a patient under medical observation. "There's a maintenance corridor on the basement level," I suggested, "used for utilities access. No cameras, minimal foot traffic." Torres nodded, then paused as footsteps echoed from the direction of the elevator. A doctor in surgical scrubs emerged, consulting a tablet and heading directly toward room 347. We separated quickly, Torres returning to his room while I busied myself with cleaning supplies, trying to look like housekeeping staff performing routine duties. Dr. Sarah Chen was Torres's attending physician, a woman in her 40s whose reputation for thoroughness was legendary throughout the hospital. She noticed everything, remembered everything, and had a talent for asking questions that made people uncomfortable. If anyone was going to notice unusual behavior or unauthorized conversations, it would be her. "Mr. Torres," she called as she approached his room. "You're supposed to be resting. Head trauma patients shouldn't be wandering the hallways unsupervised." "Just needed to walk around," Torres replied, his voice casual despite the tension I could see in his shoulders. Felt cooped up. Dr. Chen studied him with the intensity of someone trained to read medical symptoms and human behavior. "Your neurological responses have been inconsistent since admission. Memory gaps, confusion about recent events. I'd like to run additional tests to rule out complications." I continued organizing cleaning supplies while listening to their conversation, understanding that Dr. Chen's medical thoroughness could become a problem if she discovered inconsistencies in Torres's background information. Head trauma was a convenient explanation for memory issues, but it wouldn't hold up under detailed examination if she started digging into his medical history. "The tests can wait," Torres said. "I'm feeling much better, probably ready for discharge soon." "That's not your decision to make," Dr. Chen replied firmly. "You sustained significant trauma in a training accident. Your recovery requires careful monitoring and gradual rehabilitation. Rushing the process could result in permanent complications." Quote, "Training accident." The official story was already taking shape, creating a narrative that explained Torres's injuries without raising questions about classified operations or supposedly dead soldiers returning to life. Someone was working very hard to contain this situation, to manage the flow of information and control who had access to what facts. Dr. Chen disappeared into Torres's room, leaving me alone in the hallway with growing certainty that time was running short. If medical staff started conducting detailed examinations, if administrators began reviewing his file more carefully, someone was going to notice discrepancies that couldn't be explained by head trauma and clerical errors. I finished my assigned tasks on the trauma wing and moved to other areas of the hospital, maintaining the routine that had protected me for 3 years. But my mind was racing with questions that demanded answers. How many others from the Crimson Angels were still alive? What had really happened in the Hindu Kush? And why had someone gone to such elaborate lengths to convince us that we were all dead? The afternoon shift brought new complications in the form of increased security presence throughout the hospital. Military police officers appeared at key checkpoints, their presence explained as routine security updates but positioned in ways that suggested they were monitoring specific areas. 2 MPs stationed themselves near the trauma wing elevator, checking identification and asking questions about personnel movement. I was restocking supply closets when I overheard a conversation between 2 MPs that made my blood run cold. They were discussing transfer procedures for high-value patients, protocols for moving classified personnel to more secure medical facilities. Someone had decided that Torres's presence at Rampart Medical Center was becoming problematic. "Transport is scheduled for 0400 tomorrow," one of them said. "Patient will be sedated for medical reasons during transfer. Destination is classified, but it's not a regular medical facility." "What about his current treatment team?" "Dr. Chen will receive new orders tonight. Patient care will be transferred to specialists with appropriate security clearances." They were planning to disappear Torres again, to move him somewhere beyond the reach of anyone who might ask uncomfortable questions. Whatever facility they had in mind, it wasn't designed for patient recovery. It was designed for containment, for managing problems that couldn't be solved through conventional means. I spent the rest of my shift planning, using 3 years of hospital routine to map out possibilities for getting Torres out of the building before the transfer could take place. It wouldn't be easy. Security was tightening by the hour, and Torres was still recovering from injuries that made him less than fully mobile. But leaving him to be transferred meant accepting that he would disappear again, probably permanently this time. The end of my shift arrived with unusual punctuality, but instead of going home, I used my keycard to access areas of the hospital that housekeeping staff visited during overnight maintenance. The basement level was a maze of utility corridors, storage rooms, and mechanical spaces that most people forgot existed. It was also one of the few areas in the building without comprehensive surveillance coverage. I waited in a maintenance corridor near the main electrical distribution panel, surrounded by the humming machinery that kept the hospital operational. The space smelled like motor oil and industrial cleaning chemicals, and the constant noise would mask any conversation. If Torres could find a way to reach this location, we would have privacy to discuss what came next. 20 minutes later, I heard footsteps in the corridor. Torres appeared around a corner, moving carefully but with purpose.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
He'd changed into street clothes somehow, probably civilian items left by a previous patient. His head was still bandaged, but he moved like someone who'd decided that medical caution was a luxury he couldn't afford. "How long do we have?" he asked without preamble. "They're moving you at 4 in the morning," I replied. "Medical transfer to a classified facility. Once you're gone, you won't be coming back." Torres nodded grimly. "Same pattern they used before. Medical emergency, classified transfer. Then we never existed in the first place." "What happened in those mountains, Michael?" The real story, not the official version. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the concrete wall like he could see through it to distant memories. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 3 years spent living with truth that couldn't be shared. "We found the targets," he said. "High-value individuals, just like the intelligence reports indicated. But they weren't hiding in those caves. They were meeting there, conducting business with people who weren't supposed to exist." "What kind of business?" "Arms dealing, technology transfer, information that could compromise ongoing operations across multiple theaters." Torres paused, choosing his words carefully. "We discovered that some of our own people were involved. Names that would have destroyed careers, ended administrations, triggered congressional investigations that would have lasted for years. The implications hit me like a physical blow. A classified operation that had discovered corruption within the military establishment. Soldiers who'd found evidence of crimes that reached into the highest levels of command structure. No wonder they'd been declared dead. No wonder their mission had been buried so deeply that even their families couldn't access the truth. So they eliminated the problem," I said. "Made you disappear, convinced everyone that you were dead." "Not everyone," Torres corrected. 9 of us made it out of those mountains. But they only needed to silence the witnesses, not necessarily kill them. So they split us up, scattered us across different programs, different facilities. Some got new identities, some got medically discharged with psychological problems, some just vanished into classified detention." "What about the evidence you found?" "Gone. Confiscated during debriefing, classified beyond any reasonable level of access. They told us it was for national security, that revealing what we discovered would compromise ongoing operations and endanger other soldiers." Torres laughed bitterly. "Turns out, national security was just another name for protecting people who didn't want to face court-martial proceedings." I processed this information while listening to the mechanical sounds that surrounded us. 3 years of believing that Torres and the others had died heroically in service to their country, when the truth was that they'd been sacrificed to protect corruption within the system they'd sworn to defend. "Why are you here now?" I asked. "Why surface after 3 years?" "I didn't choose to surface," Torres replied. "I've been held at a facility in Montana, supposedly receiving treatment for psychological trauma related to combat stress. Isolated, monitored, with no contact with the outside world. They told me it was temporary, that I'd be released once the psychological evaluation was complete." "What changed?" 2 weeks ago, they started moving people out of the facility. Transfers to other locations. Medical procedures that didn't make sense. Administrative changes that felt like preparation for something final." Torres met my eyes. "I think they decided that keeping us alive was becoming too expensive, too risky. Whatever protection we had was running out." The facility Torres described sounded like a black site detention center, the kind of place where inconvenient people could be held indefinitely without legal process or external oversight. If they were emptying it, if they were moving toward more permanent solutions, then every surviving member of the Crimson Angels was in immediate danger. "How did you escape?" "Training exercise went wrong near the facility," Torres explained. "Real accident this time, not manufactured. Explosion during demolitions training injured several soldiers, including me. They brought us here for medical treatment. Probably figured the head injury would keep me confused and compliant. But you remembered. Not everything, not immediately. but enough to know that something was wrong with the official story. And then I saw your tattoo, and the pieces started falling into place. We stood in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of what had been revealed. 9 soldiers supposedly killed in action were actually scattered across various forms of detention, held to prevent them from revealing corruption that reached into the highest levels of military command. The families who'd grieved their deaths, the memorial services, the flag-draped coffins, all of it had been elaborate theater designed to hide crimes that would have destroyed careers and administrations. "We need to find the others," I said finally. "That's going to be difficult," Torres replied. "I only know locations for 2 of them. Rodriguez is at a psychiatric facility in Colorado, officially being treated for severe PTSD. Jackson is in a military prison in Texas, serving time for charges that were manufactured after the mission. What about the rest? Unknown. Different facilities, different cover stories. They separated us specifically to prevent coordination, to make sure we couldn't compare notes or coordinate any kind of response. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside our hiding place brought our conversation to an abrupt halt. Torres pressed himself against the wall while I grabbed a maintenance clipboard and tried to look like someone conducting routine equipment inspections. The footsteps passed without stopping, but the incident reminded us that time was running short. "I need to get back to my room before they notice I'm gone," Torres said. "But we need a plan. If they transfer me tomorrow morning, this might be our only chance." I had been thinking about possibilities while we talked, using my knowledge of hospital procedures and security protocols to identify potential escape routes. Getting Torres out of the building wouldn't be impossible, but it would require careful timing and probably some degree of luck. "There's a service entrance on the loading dock level," I suggested, "used for deliveries and maintenance equipment. Security coverage is minimal between midnight and 6 a.m., and there are blind spots in the camera system. What about transportation?" "I can handle that part. But once you're out of the building, you'll need somewhere to go. Somewhere they can't easily track you." Torres was quiet for a moment, considering options that were probably all risky and uncertain. "There's a journalist in Denver," he said finally, "investigative reporter who's been digging into military contracting scandals. If we can get evidence to her, she might be able to break the story wide enough that they can't contain it." "What evidence?" "Medical records, facility documentation, anything that proves we're alive when we're supposed to be dead. If she can verify our identities, if she can connect us to the original mission, it might be enough to force congressional attention." It was a long shot, but it was better than letting Torres disappear into another black site facility. I gave him detailed directions for reaching the service entrance, explained the timing of security patrols, and provided him with contact information for reaching me once he was clear of the hospital. "Midnight," I said. "Service entrance, loading dock level. I'll disable the camera coverage and create a distraction to draw security attention elsewhere." Torres nodded, then paused before leaving. "Elena, if this goes wrong, if they catch us, you need to understand what you're risking. They've already destroyed 9 lives to protect this secret. They won't hesitate to add yours to the list." "I know," I replied. "But I can't spend the rest of my life making beds and pretending that good soldiers died for nothing. If there's a chance to set the record straight, to honor what you all sacrificed, then I have to take it." We separated then, Torres returning to his room while I finished my official duties and prepared to clock out for what might be the last time. The next few hours would determine whether 3 years of lies could be exposed, or whether the truth would be buried even deeper than before. I drove home through evening traffic, my mind focused on the logistics of what had to happen in the next 6 hours. Getting Torres out of the hospital was only the first step in a process that would require careful planning, significant resources, and probably more luck than either of us had any right to expect. My apartment felt different that evening, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. I spent an hour gathering supplies for the escape attempt, then sat down to write a detailed account of everything Torres had told me. If something went wrong, if both of us disappeared into the classified detention system, I wanted some record of the truth to survive. The account filled 12 pages of handwritten notes, documenting names, dates, locations, and enough specific details to provide starting points for any investigation that might follow. I sealed the pages in an envelope addressed to the Denver journalist Torres had mentioned, with instructions to open it only if I failed to make contact within 1 week. At 11 o'clock, I drove back to Rampart Medical Center and parked in the employee lot. The building looked different at night, quieter but somehow more menacing. Security patrols were more frequent during overnight hours, but they followed predictable patterns that could be exploited by someone who understood the system. I used my keycard to enter through the main employee entrance, then made my way to the basement level, where utility access would allow me to reach the building's security control room. 3 years of overnight maintenance had taught me which corridors were monitored and which were blind spots in the surveillance network. The security control room was locked, but housekeeping staff had master keys for most areas of the building. I slipped inside and located the camera control system, a bank of monitors and recording equipment that covered most of the hospital's interior spaces. Finding the cameras that monitored the service entrance required several minutes of trial and error, but eventually I isolated the correct feeds. Disabling the cameras completely would trigger automatic alerts, but creating temporary blind spots was possible if done carefully. I adjusted the camera angles to create gaps in coverage around the service entrance, then set delayed timers that would restore normal positioning after 30 minutes. It wasn't perfect, but it would provide enough time for Torres to reach the exit point. The distraction I'd promised required more creativity. I accessed the building's fire alarm system through the maintenance terminal, programming a false alert in the pediatric wing that would draw security attention away from the service areas. The alarm would trigger in 15 minutes, giving me time to reach the service entrance before security responded to the false emergency. I was leaving the control room when I nearly collided with a security guard making his rounds. Officer Bradley was a veteran guard who'd worked at the hospital for over a decade, someone who knew every face on the regular staff. He looked at me with surprise and suspicion. "Martinez? What are you doing in the security area?" I held up my cleaning supplies and tried to look like someone conducting routine maintenance. Cleaning crew reported a spill near the control room. Just checking to make sure no equipment was damaged. Bradley frowned, consulting his clipboard. "I don't have any reports about spills in this area." "Probably got lost in the paperwork shuffle," I replied, keeping my voice casual. "You know how it is with overnight communications." He studied my face for several more seconds, then nodded reluctantly. "Just make sure you log any maintenance activity with the front desk." "Will do," I said, walking away with forced calm while my heart hammered against my ribs. That encounter changed everything. Bradley would remember seeing me in an area where I didn't belong, at a time when security protocols were being compromised. If the escape attempt was discovered, if investigators started looking for inside assistance, my presence in the security area would be impossible to explain, but it was too late to change plans. The timers I'd set were already counting down, and Torres was probably already moving toward the service entrance. I made my way through utility corridors to the loading dock level, arriving just as the false fire alarm began sounding in the pediatric wing. The service entrance was exactly where I'd described it to Torres, a heavy steel door that opened onto a loading dock used for deliveries and maintenance equipment. Security coverage was minimal, but not non-existent. I positioned myself in a blind spot near the door, watching for any sign of Torres while listening to radio chatter from security personnel responding to the fire alarm. Midnight came and went without any sign of Torres. Then 12:15, 12:30. The false fire alarm had been canceled after security confirmed there was no actual emergency, and patrol patterns were returning to normal. I began to worry that something had gone wrong, that Torres had been discovered or prevented from leaving his room. Then I heard footsteps in the corridor behind me, careful and measured. Torres appeared around a corner, moving slowly but with purpose. His civilian clothes were rumpled, and his bandages were partially visible beneath a baseball cap, but he looked determined rather than confused. "Sorry," he whispered as he approached. Had to wait for a nurse to finish checking rooms. I led him to the service entrance, where my modified camera angles provided temporary blind spots in the surveillance coverage. The door opened onto a loading dock that connected to the hospital's vehicle maintenance area. From there to a perimeter fence that bordered a residential neighborhood. "My car is parked 3 blocks north," I told him. "Blue Honda Civic, license plate Delta Charlie 749. Keys are under the rear bumper on the driver's side." Torres memorized the information, then looked at me with expression that mixed gratitude with concern. "What about you?" "They're going to know someone helped with this." "I'll handle that part," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure how. He nodded once, then disappeared into the darkness beyond the loading dock. I waited several minutes before returning to the building, using service corridors to avoid security cameras that were no longer disabled. My shift wasn't scheduled to end until morning, which meant I needed to be visible performing normal duties when Torres's absence was discovered. The discovery came sooner than expected. At 1:30 a.m., Dr. Chen arrived for an unscheduled patient check, probably responding to reports about Torres's earlier wandering in the hallways. I was restocking supply closets on the 3rd floor when I heard her voice over the hospital's communication system. "Security to room 347. Missing patient, possible medical emergency." Within minutes, the hospital was buzzing with activity as security personnel began searching for Torres. I continued my cleaning duties while listening to radio chatter that grew increasingly urgent as the search expanded beyond the building to surrounding areas. By 3 a.m., it was clear that Torres had successfully escaped the immediate area. Security had reviewed camera footage, but the blind spots I'd created meant they had no clear images of his exit route. They knew he'd left the building, but not how or when or with what assistance. That's when General Harrison returned. General Harrison arrived with an entourage that transformed the hospital's atmosphere from controlled urgency to something approaching martial law. Military police officers took positions at every entrance while intelligence personnel began interviewing staff members with the methodical precision of people trained to extract information from unwilling sources. The woman who had spent hours in quiet conversation with Torres now moved through the building like a storm front, leaving tension and fear in her wake. I was mopping floors in the surgical wing when 2 MPs approached me, their expressions professionally neutral but their body language suggesting this wasn't a routine inquiry. The larger of the two, a sergeant with deployment ribbons covering half his chest, consulted a tablet before addressing me directly. "Elena Martinez? You're requested for an interview regarding the missing patient from room 347. The word "requested" carried the weight of a direct order, and refusing wasn't an option that would end well for anyone involved. I set aside my cleaning supplies and followed them through corridors that had become unnaturally quiet, as if the entire hospital staff had decided that drawing attention was dangerous. They led me to a conference room that had been converted into a temporary interrogation facility. General Harrison sat at the head of a polished table, flanked by 2 intelligence officers whose faces revealed nothing about their thoughts or intentions. Behind them, a laptop computer displayed what appeared to be security footage from various areas of the hospital. "Ms. Martinez," General Harrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Please, have a seat." I sat across from her, keeping my hands folded and my expression as neutral as possible. 3 years of working in an environment where visibility meant vulnerability had taught me the value of appearing unremarkable, but I suspected that strategy wasn't going to be effective in this situation. "You work housekeeping here," she continued, consulting a file that somehow contained far more information about my background than should have been accessible through routine hospital records. "Former military, medically discharged following a training accident, currently employed in facilities maintenance. The official version of my service record, sanitized and stripped of any reference to classified operations or special assignments." I nodded confirmation, wondering how much she actually knew versus how much she was fishing for. "Were you acquainted with the patient in room 347? Had you seen him before his admission to this facility?" The question was phrased carefully, designed to elicit information without revealing how much they already knew. I met her gaze directly, using silence as a tool while I considered possible responses that wouldn't immediately incriminate myself. "I don't typically interact with patients," I replied finally. "Housekeeping staff are instructed to maintain professional distance and allow medical personnel to handle patient care." One of the intelligence officers leaned forward slightly. "That's not what I asked you, Ms. Martinez. I asked whether you recognized him." "A lot of soldiers pass through this facility," I said. "After 3 years of working here, faces start to blur together." General Harrison studied me with the intensity of someone trained to read deception and resistance. "The patient in question has an unusual medical history. No family contacts. Heavily redacted service record. Injuries consistent with combat rather than training accidents. Does any of that sound familiar to you? I understood that she was testing my knowledge, probing to see how much I knew about Torres's real background versus the official cover story. Admitting recognition would confirm my involvement in his escape, but denying it completely might be equally dangerous if they had evidence linking us together. I've seen a lot of combat injuries in this job, I said carefully. Soldiers who've served in classified operations sometimes have complicated records. Indeed they do, General Harrison replied, her tone suggesting that my answer had confirmed something she already suspected. Tell me about your own service record, Ms. Martinez. What led to your medical discharge? The question was a trap disguised as routine inquiry. My official service record contained no reference to special operations or classified missions, but if General Harrison had access to the real files, she would know that the training accident story was fabricated. Answering too specifically would reveal knowledge I wasn't supposed to possess, while being too vague would appear deliberately evasive. Post-traumatic stress following a training exercise, I replied, sticking to the official narrative. I was medically unfit for continued service and received an honorable discharge. What kind of training exercise? Mountain warfare simulation. There was an accident involving explosive devices. General Harrison exchanged glances with one of her intelligence officers, a brief communication that suggested my answers were confirming information they already possessed. She consulted her file again, then looked up with an expression that mixed professional curiosity with something approaching recognition. Interesting, she said, because according to the medical records from your discharge, you were treated for injuries consistent with actual combat rather than training scenarios. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel trauma, symptoms consistent with prolonged exposure to chemical agents. My heart rate accelerated, but I kept my expression neutral. If she had access to my real medical records, then she knew far more about my background than the cover story suggested. The question was whether she was fishing for additional information or whether she already knew the complete truth about my involvement with the Crimson Angels. Medical records can be complicated, I said. Sometimes training exercises involve realistic scenarios. Sometimes they do, General Harrison agreed. And sometimes soldiers are injured during classified operations that never officially happened, then provided with alternative explanations to protect operational security. The room fell silent except for the hum of fluorescent lighting and the distant sounds of hospital activity. I realized that this conversation had moved beyond routine investigation into something that resembled confession or confrontation. General Harrison wasn't trying to determine whether I'd helped Torres escape. She was establishing the foundation for something larger. Let me be more direct, Ms. Martinez, she continued. We have security footage showing unusual activity in areas where you were working last night. Camera systems that were temporarily disabled. False alarms that drew security attention away from critical areas. Access patterns that suggest someone with detailed knowledge of hospital procedures. One of the intelligence officers activated the laptop, displaying security footage that showed me entering the control room, adjusting equipment, moving through corridors with purpose rather than routine maintenance. The evidence was clear and undeniable, but I remained silent while they presented their case. Additionally, General Harrison said, we have communications intercepts indicating that someone provided the missing patient with detailed information about escape routes and security protocols. Information that could only come from someone with extensive access to hospital operations. They had built a compelling case for my involvement, but I sensed that this presentation was leading somewhere beyond simple prosecution for assisting a patient escape. If they wanted to charge me with criminal activity, they could have done so immediately. Instead, they were investing significant time and resources in establishing a complex narrative. The question, General Harrison continued, is not whether you assisted in the escape. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is why someone with your background would risk everything to help a patient you claim not to recognize. She paused, studying my face with the intensity of someone seeking confirmation for a theory she'd already formed. Unless, of course, you did recognize him. Unless you knew exactly who he was and what his presence in this hospital represented. The moment of truth had arrived. I could continue denying involvement and knowledge, but the evidence they'd presented made that position untenable. Or I could acknowledge what they already suspected, and hope that honesty might provide some protection against whatever consequences were coming. I recognized the tattoo, I said finally. General Harrison leaned back in her chair, and I saw satisfaction in her expression. Crimson Angels Unit Identification. Memorial ink for soldiers killed in classified operations. Soldiers who weren't supposed to exist in the first place. But you exist, Ms. Martinez. And so does Staff Sergeant Torres. Which raises interesting questions about what really happened during that operation 3 years ago. I realized that this conversation had moved beyond interrogation into something resembling recruitment or negotiation. General Harrison wasn't trying to punish me for helping Torres escape. She was confirming information that would serve some larger purpose. How much do you know about the current situation? She asked. I know that 9 soldiers were declared dead to cover up evidence of corruption within the military establishment, I replied. I know that Torres and others have been held in classified detention facilities to prevent them from revealing what they discovered. And I know that someone decided their continued existence had become inconvenient. General Harrison nodded slowly. What else do you know? I know that you spent 3 hours talking to Torres yesterday, which suggests that you're either part of the cover-up or you're trying to expose it. Which do you think is more likely? I studied her face, looking for clues about her intentions and motivations. General Harrison had a reputation for protecting her soldiers and accomplishing missions regardless of political consequences. If she was involved in covering up the Crimson Angels operation, it would represent a fundamental departure from everything she was known to stand for. I think you're trying to fix something that went wrong 3 years ago, I said. Indeed I am, she replied. The question is whether you're willing to help me do it. The offer hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that reached far beyond my current situation. Helping General Harrison meant acknowledging my involvement in classified operations, admitting to knowledge that I wasn't supposed to possess, and accepting risks that could destroy what remained of my carefully constructed civilian life. What kind of help are you talking about? The kind that requires someone with your specific background and current access to military medical facilities, she replied. Someone who understands both the operational details of what happened 3 years ago and the current system being used to contain the survivors. One of the intelligence officers activated the laptop again, displaying a map marked with locations across several states. Red dots indicated facilities where other members of the Crimson Angels were being held, while blue dots showed potential extraction points and safe houses. Torres provided us with intelligence about 2 other survivors, General Harrison explained. Rodriguez in Colorado, Jackson in Texas. But we believe there are at least 4 more being held at facilities we haven't identified yet. You want to extract all of them? I want to reunite them, provide them with legal representation, and ensure their testimony reaches congressional oversight committees that can conduct proper investigations. The scope of what she was proposing was staggering. A coordinated operation to extract multiple soldiers from classified detention facilities, followed by congressional testimony that would expose corruption reaching into the highest levels of military command. The kind of operation that could end careers, trigger criminal prosecutions, and reshape military policy for decades. Why me? I asked. You have resources, personnel, authority. What do you need from someone who's been pushing a mop for 3 years? Because, General Harrison said, you're the only person we've found who was part of the original operation and has maintained access to military facilities without being detected by the containment system. She consulted her file again, then looked up with an expression that mixed respect with calculation. Your medical discharge was processed through routine channels, your current employment appears completely legitimate, and your background check for hospital security clearance shows no red flags. As far as official systems are concerned, you're exactly what you appear to be. A former soldier with stress-related medical issues working in civilian healthcare. But you know better. I know that Elena Martinez was the primary medical specialist for Crimson Angels extraction team. I know that she saved the lives of 4 soldiers during the operation that was supposed to never have happened. And I know that she was discharged and silenced, not because of medical issues, but because her testimony would have supported the evidence that 9 soldiers died trying to expose. The intelligence officer activated another display, showing photographs of the other Crimson Angels members. Faces I remembered from briefings and operations. Soldiers who had trusted each other with their lives, and who had been betrayed by the system they'd sworn to defend. Rodriguez is being held at Pine Ridge Psychiatric Institute under treatment for severe PTSD, General Harrison continued. Jackson is serving a 15-year sentence at Fort Leavenworth for charges that were manufactured after his return from the operation. The others are scattered across facilities from California to Virginia. What's the timeline? Immediate. The facility where Torres was being held is being emptied this week. We have intelligence suggesting that permanent solutions are being implemented for remaining witnesses. The euphemism was clear and chilling. After 3 years of expensive containment, someone had decided that killing the survivors was more cost-effective than continuing to hold them indefinitely. If we're going to act, General Harrison said, it has to be within the next 72 hours. I sat in silence for several minutes, processing implications that reached far beyond my personal situation. Accepting her offer meant abandoning the safe anonymity I'd built over 3 years, accepting risks that could result in imprisonment or worse, and trusting that General Harrison's motives were legitimate rather than part of some elaborate counter-operation. But refusing meant accepting that Torres and the others would disappear permanently, that the corruption they'd discovered would remain hidden, and that their sacrifice would be forgotten along with their lives. What do you need me to do? General Harrison smiled for the first time since I'd entered the room. Help us get our soldiers home. The next 18 hours transformed my understanding of what was possible when military resources were directed toward a specific objective. General Harrison's team moved with efficiency that made my hospital escape assistance look amateurish, coordinating transportation, communication, and logistical support across multiple states simultaneously. My role was more complex than I'd initially understood. Rather than simple extraction assistance, I was providing intelligence about facility security, medical protocols, and administrative procedures that could be exploited to gain access to detention locations. 3 years of working within military healthcare systems had given me insights into vulnerabilities that weren't obvious to operational planners. The first extraction was Rodriguez from Pine Ridge Psychiatric Institute in Colorado. The facility was disguised as a civilian mental health center, but its security protocols and staff credentials revealed its true nature as a military detention site. Rodriguez had been held there under treatment for psychiatric conditions that prevented him from being released or transferred to civilian care. General Harrison's team used a medical emergency scenario to gain access, presenting credentials that identified them as federal medical transportation specialists authorized to transfer high-security patients. Rodriguez was extracted during what appeared to be a routine inter-facility transfer, then transported to a safe house where he could receive actual medical attention rather than chemical sedation designed to maintain compliance. Jackson's extraction from Fort Leavenworth was more complex, requiring coordination with military legal authorities who were convinced that new evidence had emerged relevant to his case. General Harrison used her command authority to initiate a legal review process that resulted in Jackson being transferred to a federal facility where her team could gain access. Each extraction revealed additional intelligence about the scope of the containment operation. Medical records, facility documentation, and administrative files painted a picture of systematic imprisonment designed to prevent congressional oversight or public disclosure of classified operations. But the most significant discovery came when we located the remaining 4 survivors. Rather than being held in separate facilities as we'd expected, they were all confined at a single location in Nevada that operated under the cover of military medical research. The facility was conducting experiments on soldiers with traumatic brain injuries, using the survivors as test subjects for psychological manipulation techniques. The Nevada facility required a different approach. Security was too tight for infiltration, and the legal authority that had worked for previous extractions wouldn't be effective against a facility operating under research protocols. General Harrison made the decision to use direct action, coordinating with congressional oversight staff to conduct an unannounced inspection that would expose the facility's true nature. I accompanied the inspection team as a medical consultant, using my hospital experience to identify procedures and protocols that violated standard treatment guidelines. What we found was worse than any of us had anticipated. The 4 survivors had been subjected to experimental drug therapies designed to suppress memory formation and emotional processing. Their medical records documented systematic psychological abuse disguised as treatment for combat trauma. They had been used as test subjects for interrogation techniques, pharmaceutical experiments, and behavioral modification procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics and human rights. But they were alive, they were functional, and they remembered enough to provide testimony that would expose the entire conspiracy. The congressional hearing that followed was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed. General Harrison presented evidence that documented 3 years of illegal detention, medical experimentation, and cover-up operations that reached into the Defense Department, CIA, and private military contractors. The 9 survivors of the Crimson Angels operation testified about discovering arms dealing and technology transfer operations that involved senior military officials. Most importantly, they revealed the names of the officials who had ordered their elimination rather than allowing them to report their discoveries through official channels. The political earthquake that followed destroyed careers, triggered criminal prosecutions, and led to congressional legislation that established new oversight mechanisms for classified operations. But for me, the most meaningful moment came when Torres and the others were finally able to contact their families, to prove that they were alive, and to begin rebuilding lives that had been stolen from them. 3 months later, I was working as a medical instructor at a veterans rehabilitation center, teaching skills to soldiers transitioning from military to civilian careers. The pay was better than housekeeping, the work was meaningful, and I was using training that I thought was buried forever. Torres visited occasionally, usually with updates about legal proceedings or news about how the other survivors were adapting to their freedom. He'd found work as a security consultant, using his experience to help companies protect against the kind of corruption that had nearly destroyed his life. But more than that, he'd found peace with what had happened. The truth had been revealed, justice was being served, and the sacrifice of his team had meaning beyond the cover-up that had tried to bury it. "You know what I learned from all this?" he asked during one of his visits. "What's that?" "Sometimes the most important battles aren't fought on battlefields. Sometimes they're fought by people who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable." I thought about that conversation often in the months that followed, about how dismissal and invisibility could be turned into strength, how routine work could become the foundation for extraordinary action, and how the most overlooked people sometimes carry the keys to problems that seem impossible to solve. The woman making beds in a military hospital had been written off as dead weight by people who measured value in terms of rank and authority. But she had been exactly the right person in exactly the right place when heroes needed someone to help them come home. Sometimes the people who look powerless are the ones with the power to change everything. Sometimes the most important voices belong to people nobody wants to hear. And sometimes the difference between justice and injustice comes down to one person willing to do what's right, regardless of the personal cost. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, but it often needs help from people willing to take risks that more cautious individuals wouldn't consider. People who understand that some things are more important than job security, personal safety, or social acceptance. People who know that dead weight can become the foundation for justice, if someone has the courage to recognize its true value. The phone rang at 3 a.m, jarring me from sleep with the kind of urgency that meant someone was in serious trouble. 6 months had passed since the congressional hearings, since the truth about the Crimson Angels had transformed from buried secret to front-page news. I'd grown accustomed to sleeping peacefully, no longer startling awake with dreams of desert mountains and classified detention facilities. But the voice on the other end of the line reminded me that some battles never truly end. "Elena, it's Torres. We have a problem." I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. Torres's voice carried the same tension I remembered from our hospital conversations, the careful control of someone dealing with information that could get people killed. "What kind of problem?" 3 more survivors have surfaced, soldiers who weren't part of our original team but were eliminated using the same protocols. They're being hunted, and the people hunting them have access to resources that shouldn't exist anymore. The implications hit me like cold water. The congressional investigations had supposedly dismantled the networks responsible for the illegal detention operations. But bureaucratic machinery had a way of adapting rather than disappearing. If new survivors were emerging, if they were being actively pursued, then someone had learned from the Crimson Angels' exposure and developed more sophisticated methods of containment. Where are they now? Safe house in Virginia, but not for long. They reached out through back channels, people who remembered my name from the testimony. One of them is a Navy SEAL who was supposed to have died in a submarine accident. Another is an Air Force intelligence officer who officially committed suicide after a psychiatric breakdown. The third is a Marine who was declared missing in action during a humanitarian mission in Somalia. Each description painted a picture of systematic elimination disguised as routine military casualties. If Torres was right, if these weren't isolated incidents, then the Crimson Angels operation had been part of something much larger than we'd understood. "They need extraction," Torres continued, "but the people looking for them aren't using official military resources. This is private sector, contractors with government connections and unlimited funding. I was already getting dressed, muscle memory taking over, while my mind processed tactical considerations. The rehabilitation center where I worked had given me new purpose and relative safety, but it had also made me soft in ways that might prove dangerous. 3 years of housekeeping, followed by 6 months of classroom instruction, wasn't ideal preparation for running operations against professional killers. What do you need from me? Medical assessment and transportation assistance. 2 of them have injuries that need attention, and all 3 need documents that will allow them to move freely without triggering identity verification systems. Medical assessment I could handle. Transportation and documentation were more complex, requiring resources and connections I'd never needed to develop. But refusing wasn't an option, not when soldiers were in danger and I had skills that might keep them alive. Send me the address. I'll be there in 4 hours. The drive to Virginia gave me time to think about how much my life had changed since the morning I'd first seen Torres's tattoo. 6 months ago, I'd been invisible, dismissed, existing on the margins of a system that had no use for my knowledge or experience. Now I was driving toward another classified crisis, carrying skills and insights that could mean the difference between life and death for soldiers who'd been written off as casualties. But this time was different. Instead of working alone, improvising solutions with hospital supplies and stolen access codes, I was part of a network that included Torres, General Harrison, and congressional oversight staff who could provide official support when circumstances required it. The isolation that had once protected me had been replaced by connections that offered both resources and accountability. The safe house occupied a farmhouse in rural Virginia, surrounded by enough open ground to make surveillance difficult and approach routes easy to monitor. Torres met me at the entrance, looking better than he had during our hospital encounter, but carrying new stress lines that suggested recent experiences had been challenging. "How bad is it?" I asked as he led me through security checkpoints that included electronic countermeasures and armed personnel who weren't wearing official uniforms. "Bad enough that General Harrison is coordinating directly with intelligence agencies that normally don't acknowledge each other's existence," Torres replied. "The contractors hunting these people have access to satellite surveillance, communication intercepts, and database searches that suggest government cooperation at levels we haven't identified yet." We entered a main room where 3 people sat around a table covered with maps, photographs, and documents that told stories of betrayal and survival. The first was a woman in her 30s whose bearing identified her as military, despite civilian clothes that looked like they'd been acquired recently. The second was a man whose age was difficult to determine, marked by the kind of weathering that came from extended deployment in hostile environments. The third was younger, probably mid-20s, but his eyes carried experiences that belonged to someone much older. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell," Torres said, introducing the woman. "Officially killed in a submarine reactor accident 18 months ago. Actually discovered evidence of naval contractors selling classified sonar technology to foreign intelligence services." Mitchell nodded acknowledgement, but didn't speak immediately. Her eyes were constantly moving, scanning windows and doorways with the paranoid vigilance of someone who'd learned that safety was temporary and enemies were everywhere. "Captain David Hassan," Torres continued, indicating the weathered man. "Air Force intelligence specialist who discovered that private military companies were using official intelligence assets to coordinate drug trafficking operations through military transport aircraft." Hassan looked up from the documents he'd been studying. "They tried to eliminate me using a psychiatric evaluation that would have resulted in indefinite commitment to a military mental health facility. I escaped during transfer and have been underground for 8 months." "And Corporal James Wright," Torres said, gesturing toward the youngest of the 3. Marine Force reconnaissance who documented humanitarian aid supplies being diverted to armed rebel groups in Somalia. His unit was supposed to have been eliminated by hostile action, but he survived and made it back to friendly territory. Wright's story was written in scars that covered his arms and neck, evidence of injuries that went far beyond routine combat trauma. Someone had tried very hard to make sure he didn't survive to report what he'd witnessed. They all discovered evidence of contractors using military resources for illegal operations, Torres explained. And they were all eliminated using methods that avoided official attention while ensuring they couldn't reveal what they'd learned. I sat down at the table, studying the faces of soldiers who'd experienced the same betrayal that had nearly destroyed the Crimson Angels. The scope of what they represented was staggering. Not isolated incidents of corruption, but systematic exploitation of military operations by private interests that had captured portions of the defense establishment. What kind of evidence are we talking about? I asked. Mitchell opened a waterproof case that contained documents, photographs, and data storage devices that represented months of careful documentation. Communication intercepts showing coordination between military contractors and foreign intelligence services. Financial records proving that classified technology was being sold through unofficial channels. Personnel files demonstrating that soldiers who discovered these operations were systematically eliminated. Hassan added his own materials to the collection. Transportation manifests showing military aircraft being used for drug trafficking. Intelligence reports that were falsified to justify operations that had nothing to do with national security. Orders directing military personnel to provide support for activities that violated international law. Wright's contribution was more personal but equally damning. Video recordings of humanitarian supplies being loaded onto trucks operated by rebel groups. Communications between military officers and private contractors coordinating the diversion of aid intended for civilian populations. Medical records showing that soldiers who questioned these operations were diagnosed with psychological disorders that justified their removal from active duty. The evidence they'd assembled painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached far beyond the arms dealing and technology transfer that the Crimson Angels had discovered. This was institutional capture. Private interests using military resources and personnel to conduct operations that served profit rather than national security. The problem, Torres said, is that the same congressional oversight mechanisms that helped us expose the Crimson Angels conspiracy are being undermined by the people we're trying to investigate. Committee members are receiving information that discredits these witnesses before they can testify. Intelligence agencies are being fed false reports that suggest these soldiers are unstable, unreliable, or potentially dangerous to national security. They're using our own success against us, Mitchell added. The publicity from the Crimson Angels hearings has made it easier for them to dismiss new whistleblowers as attention-seeking or mentally unstable. I realized that the victory we'd celebrated 6 months ago had been incomplete. Exposing one conspiracy had alerted others to the need for better concealment and more sophisticated countermeasures. The people responsible for systematic corruption had learned from our methods and developed new strategies for protecting their operations. What's the current threat assessment? I asked. Torres activated a laptop that displayed surveillance photographs taken over the past 48 hours. 3 different teams of contractors have been identified in the local area. Professional surveillance, electronic monitoring, and what appears to be preparation for direct action against this location. The photographs showed vehicles, personnel, and equipment that suggested military-level capabilities operating under civilian cover. These weren't government agents conducting official investigations. They were private operators with resources that indicated significant financial backing and institutional support. They know we're here, Hassan said. The question is whether they're planning extraction or elimination. Wright looked up from the maps he'd been studying. Based on what happened to other witnesses who've tried to come forward, elimination is more likely. Dead witnesses can't contradict official narratives. The conversation was interrupted by a communication device that crackled with General Harrison's voice. She was coordinating from a command center that could provide intelligence support but not direct intervention without triggering political complications that might undermine the broader investigation. Movement on the perimeter, her voice reported. Multiple contacts approaching from 3 directions. Recommend immediate evacuation to secondary location. Torres began gathering the evidence materials while the others prepared for rapid departure. But I realized that evacuation would only delay the confrontation, not resolve it. The contractors hunting these witnesses had resources that would allow them to track us anywhere we went. Running would buy time, but not safety. Wait, I said. Instead of running, what if we made them come to us on our terms? Everyone stopped moving, turning to look at me with expressions that mixed curiosity with skepticism. The idea that was forming in my mind was risky, possibly suicidal, but it offered possibilities that simple evacuation didn't provide. Explain, Torres said. They want to eliminate witnesses who can expose their operations. But what if those witnesses disappeared in a way that generated maximum publicity rather than ensuring silence? I activated my own communication device, contacting media personnel who'd been following the military corruption story since the Crimson Angels hearings. Investigative journalists, congressional staff members, and oversight officials who would be very interested in documenting what happened when private contractors attempted to silence military whistleblowers. We document everything, I continued. Live broadcasts, multiple camera angles, real-time uploads to servers that can't be easily compromised. If they want to eliminate us, they have to do it in front of witnesses who can't be silenced afterward. Mitchell understood immediately. Turn the elimination attempt into evidence of the conspiracy we're trying to expose. Exactly. They're counting on being able to control the narrative, to make us disappear without generating attention that might compromise their operations. But if our disappearance becomes a public event, if it's documented by multiple independent sources, then it becomes impossible to dismiss or cover up. Torres was already coordinating with General Harrison's team, arranging for news crews and congressional observers to respond to the location. The response time would be critical. We needed documentation to arrive before the contractors could complete whatever operation they were planning. Hassan positioned himself near windows that provided observation of approach routes, while Wright established communication protocols that would allow us to coordinate with outside support. Mitchell organized the evidence materials in ways that would ensure their preservation regardless of what happened to us personally. They're moving, Hassan reported. 3 vehicles, approximately 12 personnel, approaching from different directions simultaneously. The professional nature of their approach confirmed that these weren't government agents operating under legal authority. Official law enforcement would have announced their presence, provided identification, and followed established protocols for dealing with potential witnesses. The coordination and tactics being displayed suggested military training applied to illegal objectives. My communication device activated with incoming calls from news organizations responding to the information Torres had provided. Within minutes, satellite trucks and camera crews would be en route to document whatever transpired at the safe house. The contractors would have to choose between completing their mission in front of witnesses or aborting an operation they'd probably spent weeks planning. Contact, Wright announced as vehicles appeared on the access road leading to the farmhouse. The lead vehicle was a black SUV with tinted windows and license plates that probably belonged to a vehicle that didn't exist in official databases. Behind it, 2 more vehicles carried additional personnel and equipment that suggested they were prepared for extended operations rather than quick strikes. But instead of stopping at a distance and attempting communication, the vehicles continued toward the house with the aggressive positioning of people who intended to use force rather than negotiation. Whatever they'd been instructed to accomplish, it wasn't capture or questioning. Weapons visible, Hassan reported. Multiple contacts exiting vehicles. This is not a law enforcement operation. Torres activated emergency communication protocols that would alert General Harrison's command center, congressional oversight staff, and news organizations simultaneously. If we were about to be eliminated, the attempt would be documented by multiple independent sources who could ensure that our deaths served the cause we'd been fighting for. The contractors approached the house with professional tactical formations that revealed extensive military training. But they were also operating under assumptions that had been valid before the Crimson Angels' revelations changed the political landscape. They expected to encounter isolated witnesses who could be eliminated without generating broader attention. Instead, they found themselves approaching a location that was rapidly becoming the focus of congressional and media interest. News helicopters were already en route. Congressional staff members were demanding real-time updates, and military oversight officials were coordinating response protocols that would ensure comprehensive documentation. The lead contractor, a man whose bearing suggested senior military experience, approached the front entrance while his team established perimeter positions. But instead of aggressive entry procedures, he knocked on the door with the formality of someone conducting official business. Torres opened the door while the rest of us positioned ourselves in locations that would be visible to arriving news crews. Whatever conversation was about to take place, it needed to be documented by witnesses who couldn't be silenced or discredited afterward. You're harboring individuals who are wanted for questioning regarding classified military operations, the contractor announced, his voice carrying authority that was undermined by the lack of official identification or legal warrants. What individuals? Torres replied. What operations? What legal authority authorizes this questioning? The contractor's hesitation revealed that he hadn't been prepared for questions that demanded specific answers. His mission parameters probably assumed compliance based on intimidation rather than legal process. The individuals inside this building are in possession of classified materials that were obtained through unauthorized means, he continued. They need to be transferred to appropriate authorities for debriefing and security assessment. Which authorities? I called from inside the house, making sure my voice would be picked up by communication equipment that was broadcasting our conversation to multiple locations. What's your name, your organization, and your legal authorization for conducting operations on American soil? By this point, the sound of approaching helicopters was audible, and the contractor realized that his mission had become significantly more complicated. News crews were minutes away from documenting whatever transpired, and the witnesses he'd been sent to eliminate were actively broadcasting their location and circumstances. The tactical advantage that had existed when we were isolated and vulnerable had evaporated. Now, the contractors were the ones who needed to worry about documentation and accountability. Their presence at the safe house was being recorded by multiple sources. Their identities were being captured by high-resolution cameras, and their actions were being witnessed by people who could provide testimony to congressional investigators. "Stand down," came a voice over the contractor's communication system. "Mission parameters have changed. Return to base immediately." The lead contractor looked frustrated but compliant. Whatever organization had sent them had decided that the potential exposure outweighed the value of completing their original objectives. They began withdrawing to their vehicles with the disciplined efficiency of people who understood that operational security sometimes required tactical retreat. But as they prepared to leave, Wright emerged from the house carrying one of the waterproof cases containing evidence materials. "Since you're here representing appropriate authorities," he called to the departing contractors, "maybe you'd like to review some of the documentation we've been discussing." The contractor stopped, turned, and for a moment I thought he might decide to complete his mission regardless of the changing circumstances. But the sound of approaching news helicopters and the realization that their withdrawal was being recorded by multiple cameras convinced him that discretion was preferable to direct confrontation. "This isn't over," he said quietly. "You're right," Wright replied. "It's just getting started." The next 6 hours transformed our isolated safe house into the center of a media and political storm that reached from local news stations to congressional oversight committees. The attempted intimidation of military witnesses became the lead story on national news programs, generating exactly the kind of attention that the contractors had been hired to prevent. More importantly, the evidence that Mitchell, Hassan, and Wright had assembled began receiving the kind of serious analysis that had been impossible when they were isolated and on the run. Congressional investigators, military oversight officials, and independent analysts confirmed that their documentation revealed systematic corruption that extended far beyond anything the Crimson Angels had discovered. Within a week, congressional hearings were scheduled to examine their testimony. Within a month, federal prosecutors were reviewing evidence for potential criminal charges against military contractors and the officials who had facilitated their operations. Within 6 months, legislation was being debated that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between military forces and private contractors. But the personal impact was more immediate and more meaningful. 3 soldiers who had been hunted, isolated, and marked for elimination found themselves surrounded by support networks that included legal representation, medical care, and protection from the kind of retaliation they'd faced while underground. "You know what I learned from this?" Mitchell said during one of our debriefing sessions. "What's that? The system can be captured by people with bad intentions, but it can also be reclaimed by people willing to fight for what's right." I thought about that observation often in the months that followed. About how corruption thrives in darkness but withers under scrutiny. About how isolated witnesses can be eliminated, but connected networks can defend themselves. About how the most powerful weapon against institutional betrayal is transparency, supported by people who refuse to accept that injustice is inevitable. The rehabilitation center where I worked began receiving referrals from soldiers who discovered evidence of corruption within their units. Instead of being isolated and targeted for elimination, they were connected with legal resources, media contacts, and congressional oversight staff who could ensure their safety while their testimony was being evaluated. Torres established a nonprofit organization that provided support for military whistleblowers, using lessons learned from our experiences to protect soldiers who were willing to expose corruption. The organization's first principle was that no witness should face retaliation alone, that collective action was more effective than individual courage. General Harrison used her position to institutionalize reforms that made it more difficult for private contractors to exploit military resources for illegal operations. New oversight mechanisms, enhanced transparency requirements, and stronger protections for witnesses created structural barriers to the kind of systematic corruption we'd uncovered. But perhaps the most important change was cultural rather than institutional. The success of our efforts demonstrated that ordinary people could challenge powerful interests and win, that dismissed individuals could become catalysts for systemic reform, and that courage multiplied by coordination could overcome resources multiplied by corruption. The woman who had been making beds and emptying trash cans had become part of a network that transformed military accountability. The soldiers who had been written off as dead weight had become voices that could no longer be silenced. And the truth that had been buried under layers of classification and denial had become the foundation for justice that would protect future generations of soldiers. Sometimes the most important battles are fought not by people with authority and resources, but by people with knowledge and courage. Sometimes the most powerful weapons against institutional corruption are transparency and persistence, wielded by individuals who refuse to accept that betrayal is inevitable. And sometimes the difference between justice and injustice comes down to people who understand that being overlooked can become an advantage, that being dismissed can become protection, and that being underestimated can become the foundation for victory against opponents who never saw them coming. 2 years have passed since that confrontation at the Virginia Safe House, and the world looks different when you understand how much can change when the right people decide to act at the right moment. I'm standing in a conference room at the Pentagon, wearing a civilian consultant badge that grants me access to briefings that were once so classified I wasn't supposed to know they existed. The irony isn't lost on me that the woman who spent 3 years being invisible in a military hospital is now helping to design transparency protocols that will prevent future soldiers from disappearing into the system that nearly consumed us all. The reforms we fought for have become institutional reality. The Military Whistleblower Protection Enhancement Act passed with bipartisan support, creating legal safeguards and support networks that ensure soldiers who discover corruption can report it without fear of retaliation or elimination. Congressional oversight committees now have direct access to classified facilities, preventing the kind of black site detention that kept Torres and the others imprisoned for years. Most importantly, private military contractors are subject to transparency requirements that make it nearly impossible for them to exploit government resources for illegal operations. But the real victory isn't measured in legislation or policy changes. It's measured in the faces of soldiers who walk into my office at the rehabilitation center, carrying evidence of wrongdoing and confident that they'll be heard rather than silenced. They know their testimony will be taken seriously, that they'll have legal protection, and that speaking truth to power won't result in their names being added to casualty lists for missions that never officially happened. Torres stopped by yesterday with updates about the other survivors. Mitchell has returned to active duty with the Navy, where she's using her experience to train intelligence officers in recognizing and reporting corruption within their chains of command. Hassan works for the Inspector General's office, conducting investigations that ensure accountability within the Air Force's relationship with private contractors. Wright has become a congressional liaison, helping lawmakers understand the operational realities that create opportunities for institutional betrayal. Each of them carries scars from what they endured, but they also carry knowledge that makes them uniquely valuable in preventing others from experiencing the same betrayal. The system that tried to eliminate them has been transformed by their survival, their testimony, and their refusal to accept that injustice was inevitable. The phone calls still come occasionally. Soldiers who've discovered evidence that their units are being exploited for illegal operations. Intelligence officers who've identified corruption within their agencies. Medical personnel who've been ordered to falsify records or provide treatment that serves political rather than therapeutic purposes. Each call represents someone who might have been eliminated or silenced before our reforms created alternatives to disappearance. Last month, I received a call from a young Army medic who discovered that medical supplies intended for civilian populations were being diverted to armed rebel groups in Syria. Instead of being isolated and targeted for elimination, she was connected with congressional investigators, provided with legal representation, and offered protection while her testimony was being evaluated. Within weeks, her evidence had triggered an investigation that exposed systematic exploitation of humanitarian missions for weapons trafficking. The difference between her experience and what happened to the Crimson Angels illustrates how much can change when institutional structures support rather than suppress the truth. She kept her career, her family remained safe, and her evidence led to prosecutions rather than cover-ups. The system that once devoured whistleblowers now protects them, transforms their knowledge into accountability, and ensures their courage serves justice rather than being buried with their bodies. But perhaps the most meaningful change is cultural rather than structural. Military personnel now understand that reporting corruption is a duty rather than a death sentence, that institutional loyalty means protecting the integrity of the system rather than the careers of individuals who exploit it. The fear that once kept soldiers silent has been replaced by confidence that speaking truth will be rewarded rather than punished. General Harrison, now serving as Undersecretary of Defense for Personnel and Readiness, often speaks about the transformation that began with a dismissed woman recognizing a tattoo on a soldier who wasn't supposed to exist. She uses our story to illustrate how accountability depends on ordinary people being willing to take extraordinary risks when they encounter injustice that threatens the principles they've sworn to defend. The memorial wall that once contained Torres's name, along with 8 other soldiers who'd supposedly died in the Hindu Kush, has been redesigned. Instead of commemorating fictional deaths, it now honors soldiers who've sacrificed careers, safety, and comfort to expose corruption within the military establishment. Their names represent victories rather than casualties, proof that courage can overcome institutional betrayal when it's supported by people who refuse to accept that heroes must die to protect the truth. I think about that wall often when I'm working with new clients at the rehabilitation center. Soldiers transitioning from military to civilian careers, veterans dealing with injuries that go beyond physical trauma, families struggling to understand why their loved ones were targeted for elimination rather than recognition. Each story reminds me that the battle for institutional integrity is ongoing, that corruption adapts to new circumstances, and that vigilance is the price of preventing future betrayals. The housekeeping cart I once pushed through hospital corridors sits in my garage now, a reminder of how invisibility can become an advantage when ordinary people decide to act on extraordinary knowledge. The woman who was dismissed as dead weight became the catalyst for reforms that will protect generations of soldiers who haven't been born yet. The tattoo that should have memorialized dead heroes instead became the symbol of living witnesses who refused to let truth be buried with their bodies. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd walked past Torres's room that morning without recognizing the ink on his arm. If I'd continued my routine of cleaning in silence, accepting that some things were too dangerous or too classified for someone like me to challenge, the 9 soldiers who survived the Hindu Kush operation might have disappeared permanently, their evidence might have been buried forever, and the corruption they discovered might have continued destroying lives and compromising missions for decades. But I didn't walk past. I recognized a brother in arms who needed help, and I decided that 3 years of invisibility had prepared me perfectly for the kind of action that changes everything. The skills I'd learned making beds and mopping floors became the foundation for operations that extracted soldiers from detention facilities and exposed corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. The most overlooked person in the building became the most important person in the room when heroes needed someone to help them come home. The woman everyone dismissed became the witness whose testimony could destroy careers and reshape institutions. And the tattoo that was supposed to memorialize the dead became the symbol of the living who refused to stay buried. That's the lesson I share with every soldier who walks into my office carrying evidence of wrongdoing. Sometimes the most powerful person in any situation is the one nobody takes seriously. Sometimes the most important voice belongs to someone everybody ignores. And sometimes the difference between justice and injustice comes down to one person being willing to do what's right when everyone else has decided that looking the other way is safer. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, but it often needs help from people who understand that being underestimated is an advantage, that being dismissed is protection, and that being forgotten by the powerful means being remembered by the powerless. People who know that dead weight can become the foundation for justice. If someone has the courage to recognize its true value and the wisdom to understand that heroes don't always look like what we expect them to look like. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.